Session 3 and 4 taught by Dr. Reams and Black in 1977. This is Tape 3 Side A.
Monday, 2 p.m., June the 27th, 1977, Session number 3 and 4, taught by Dr. John L. Black and Dr. Carey Reams. Dr. Reams, Biological Theory of Ionization, Murrieta Hot Springs, California. Dr. Black dwells on I theology. Tape number 3-6/27-7/1-77.
And if that layer of cells is constantly propagating new cells are generating. Now, if the cell goes this way, it eventually becomes a lens cell. If the cell goes that way, it becomes an iris cell. And they come from the same base, from the exact same base. The only difference being is that based on the nature of the body, this cell is going to go one way or it's going to go the other. Now, these cells that make up these lens lay in long, long fibers. They become very, very long, and they've got little nuclei in them. You can see the nuclei as you look under them under the microscope, little center of the cell, and they become very, very long, very elongated. They start out almost square when they're at the edge, and they start becoming very, very elongated. And as long as they lay in a perfect arrangement relative to the center of that lens, the lens remains clear, and you can see. Should the energy and the mineral balance change to the point where some of these cells start to grow crossways, you have a cataract. Okay? Now, you notice that lens is made up in sections for all practical purposes. If this one particular section grows okay, or grows haywire, and all the other sections grow okay, then you've got an astigmatism. Yeah, if you've got all of the fibers laying relative to the center of that lens, except you've got one section that's growing slightly haywire, for instance, growing like this, because of damage or because of loss of energy or because of the fact that embryologically there was a weakness in the cells along that border of the disc or due to mineral imbalance or whatever, if you get that one section growing wiggly or wavy, you come up with an astigmatism. And if the fibers grow across or layer across one another, you have a cataract. Okay? And of course, all of you know what a cataract is. That's what a rich Chinese person drives. Oh, only when they can't afford Lincoln Continental. Now, the other thing is that now that we've got that thought out of the way, note that these cells can either go inward or outward, and note that when they're in the lens, they become very elongated, very fiber-like. Now, the unique thing is let's just take the eye straight on, and there's another place where this is happening. Let's say this is the pupil of the eye right here, and this is the iris of the eye. We're going to have a super small pupil. Okay? This particular guy is massively parasympathetic dominant. Okay? And over here we have the sclera. Now, we note that we have a migration of cells that can go inward toward the lens or come outward. And these cells that grow outward only grow out just so far. They'll only extend so far out there onto the iris. And they grow like so. And to look at these cells after they've grown in there for a while, they look like a small rosetta. In other words, the cell fiber grows out, touches other fibers growing inward, and bends back in on itself and grows back toward the pupillary area of the eye again. And out here, along the edge of the cornea, we have an area that's called the limbus. This ring is called the limbus. And there's another layer of cells out here that have the ability to either grow inward or outward, depending on what the need is. Now these cells that grow inward, they grow downward, and when they touch these other cells in there, they turn around and they come back. So the cells coming from the outside grow inward like this, and where they meet forms a ring that's actually visible right in here. You can actually observe the eye, and you can see this particular ring that's going around in the iris of the eye. And they refer to this as the autonomic nerve ring or wreath. And all it is just the junction place of where these cells from the limbus have been growing inward and have met due to contact inhibition and ceased growth with those cells that are growing outward from the lens iral junction. And so now you've got two different layers of fibers in that eye up to that point. Now it is unique because the tighter that these fibers lay in the eye, the greater the constitution of the individual is. So the tighter those fibers lay, going outward and inward, the greater the person's constitution is, and the better that it's going, or the easier it's going to be for him to resist disease in his body, or the more likely that he is to respond more effectively. Now, what happens to these other cells? They grow out, and once again, they begin to form very, very long fibrous cells that begin to grow out. And they're white on the outside of the sclera, as you know, unless the sclera has disease or damage. And these cells grow out, and they're fibrous in nature, and they form a bag that goes clear around to the optic nerve, and this bag would be collapsed except for the fact it's full of fluid. So the fluid in the eye literally blows the eye up, in effect making a miniature camera out of it. Now these fibers are white, as I said, on the outside, but as you look at the inside of the eye, they're brown. But you can only see them for a short while because they go back to the serrata dentata, and from then on, back around behind the eye is where the retina is, and the retina overlays the sclera back there, so you can't see the sclera except by very, very acute instrumentation on the inside of the eye in most instances. Once in a while you can see it when there's a detached retina or something, but we're not going to be looking in there anyway. Now, here's some of the things that is important. I told you that the closer that these fibers were together, the better the constitution of that individual was. So therefore, if you have an area like this in that eye in which those fibers are not together, that these fibers have pulled apart, that these fibers have left a hole in which you can look down for varying degrees further into the matrix of the iris. They refer to this as an inherent weakness. This inherent weakness have been, the location of them have been mapped so that these inherent weaknesses can in fact be applied to a given area of the body. Now, here is the next thing that I want you to pick up on. As this sclera develops with these fibers, if stress on the eye in general causes these fibers to start to split apart, to begin to pull apart from one another, it leaves a small channel that a blood vessel grows down. Now, does that explain to you how the vessels in the sclera can become significant? I said that in the iris of the eye, if you see areas where these fibers are separated, that this is referred to as an inherent weakness. And by the mapping of the eye, Dr. Jensen and other researchers before him have been able to determine that certain areas in this eye relate to certain areas in the body. And so by knowing where the inherent weakness is, you can in fact determine a weak area or an area that may be susceptible to toxicity in the tissue. Now the same procedure that lets these fibers pull apart in the iris can occur in the sclera of the eye. But as an inherent weakness begins to occur in the sclera of the eye, and the fibers become less dense, a vessel grows in at that particular point in an effort to increase the blood supply to that area of the sclera to enhance healing of that particular area. And so the greater the degree of vascularization, the greater the degree of underlying fiber degeneration. And these areas have been mapped to the point that there is a significant correlation between where you see this vessel grow in at and what this vessel looks like when it gets there and the the body physiology itself. Now, the unique thing is, however, is that while there are a number of correlations between the sclera and the iris, for some reason, the sclera, being more extensive, shows patterns that that will not show up in exactly the same area in the iris, because of the fact that you may in fact see in one area of the sclera evidence that the thyroid is affected. You'll go over the iris and find that the thyroid is affected, but also in the iris you'll begin to find tiredness in the legs, you'll begin to find depressed life centers and various other things, and then you look at the overall picture between what you have seen relative to the pattern in the sclera plus what you have seen in the iris, and then you can begin to see the correlation, because you don't know sometimes if that vascular weakness in the sclera is just now growing in or whether or not it may be healing and growing back out. So you need the iris to tell you whether you're dealing with an acute, subacute, chronic, or degenerative factor. You need the sclera to give you a simple evaluation of the degree of overall stress, and you can put the two of them together, and they tie together pretty well as a simple approach. Now, as you get more and more involved, then you will begin to find that you will look at the general patterns on the sclera, but that you will look for your specific problem relative to the iris, because of the fact you can delineate the nature of the problem usually right off the bat. But people have said, how does the sclera function? How can anything be in the sclera? How can anything at all be dependent in this particular thing? And you must remember that initially, when this eyeball developed, that there was a cup like this that was an extension outward from the brain stalk, this being what will eventually be the optic nerve, and there was a layer of cells that started right in here, and that layer of cells eventually became the entire eye. And so the same fibrous network that supplies fibers to the lens supplies it to the iris. The same fibrous cellular structure that supplies fibers to the iris is also supplying fibers to the sclera. So as you see one, you begin then to see that there is a correlation between them. Now, from what I have told you on this, you can begin to see that just because you've got something setting up here in whatever it may be, 27, if you've got a little blotch in 27, it's not going to designate anything. However, if you have a significant vascular ingrowth or patterning in this particular area, for instance like that, and say this is a 15-25 range right here instead of 27, and we'll get into that later. But anyway, if you were to see that particular pattern coming in, it would show that there is a probability of a health picture that you can interpret and identify being present in that particular person's body. But again, it is a pattern, and it is not a given individual number. Now let's start taking these things, and let's go one step further. As you look at your drawing in front of you, you'll find that they are marked off at 6, 3, 9, and 12. All right? Now, the reasoning for marking these drawings off that way is because of the fact that positioning on that vessel, or positioning of the vessel, or positioning of the flame, or positioning of the pattern is pretty important, and so your equator line becomes a very, very important aspect, but equally important, of course, comes your vertical component. Now, surprisingly enough, a vast percentage of your horizontal vessels in the eye will grow away from that 1-3 area, and the large percentage of your vertical vessels will grow away from the 612 area. And that very, very frequently, if you see a vessel coming in, say, from over here, very, very frequently, if you could go further around the eyeball, you'd find it was coming from that general area anyway. Do you see what I mean? So anyway, when you see a vessel showing up in between on these coordinates, in here and here and here, very, very frequently it's a vessel that has started in this area and has grown around and it's now becoming visible in that particular quadrant. In other words, it's looped itself around the eyeball, for lack of a better word, and now it's visible coming back in toward the center. There is an exception, and that is some vessels that we will go over will grow from the limbus, which is right here, outward, and in certain cases where the sclera and the iris has been damaged or degenerated in exactly the same point, the vessel can grow right across the sclera and into the iris, so that you can literally have a blood vessel growing in the iris of the eye. That's because of the fact it had a channel right there, and it grew in an effort to take oxygenation and mineralization into that particular area. Have you seen very many vessels cross into the iris, Lynn? Mm-hmm. You don't see too many, but they'll get in there. They'll get in there, and once in a while, if you get the whole system toxic enough, you may in fact see the cornea growing over the iris. And when you do that, usually it's indicative of an anemic-like condition or either a reduction in red blood cells or a reduction in the oxygen-carrying capacity of the red blood cells. So you can see vessels going into the iris on occasion. And on occasion, you can literally see the scleral membrane, the conjunctiva, actually growing right on over on top of the iris to the point where that you can study it and see it. Now, I've asked this lady across the street to I've asked this lady across the street to get us a slug of pen lights for those people who may not have the best eyes in the world. And later on this afternoon, after the supper hour, Lynn Johnston is going to start picking you up and start taking you through basic iridology. And I'll continue on through and then continue working with you on the sclerology tomorrow, and then get back onto some of the other things that are on the syllabus that have to be covered before Doc finishes you guys up. So let's start looking now at some of the patterns that it's going to be possible for you to see, and let's see what we can come up with. Okay, first let's take a look at the equator line. Okay, now you've got drawings right there in front of you. Should have 4 of them that you can work on, and we'll pass out some others that go to other parts of the eyes. And you can draw in on here and make notes on these papers and various other things. And you'll see a dotted line going across that drawing. And that dotted line is the approximate range that the average individual usually opens the eye. Okay? And that's the reason why that I've told you that you have to get in there and really open that thing up. But a lot of times why you haven't, as a result, it's been difficult for you to record numbers straight above the eye or straight below the eye or the iris because of the fact that you have not been able to see them, because if you roll the eye in, that area has been obscured. But if you're going to utilize sclerology as a means of getting some sort of an idea of what you're doing, you must open that eye up to the point where you can observe the orb and record accordingly. Okay, now the toxic bow line, and we're going to be talking now about patterns found in either eye. So when you draw this in, it will be a pattern that can be apparent in either eye. Okay, let's take a look at the equator line, 1 to 12 in each eye. This is your toxic bowel line. It has absolutely nothing to do with the transverse colon. It is the bowel in general. It shows autointoxicity coming back into the system. Now, the more narrow the line, and it may be just a little bit of vasculature coming in here, or it may be a slight yellowish discoloration coming in here. And I think all of you, when you get a chance to look at eyes later on this week, will be able to look at one another's eye, and you'll be able to see a discoloration coming in there. Maybe yellowish, maybe pinkish. It may be light brownish discoloration coming across that particular point. There may be many small vessels involved with it, or in some instances, there will be a definite prominent vessel involved. But if the prominent vessel is involved, there is a single prominent vessel involved. It usually does not signify bowel toxicity. To have bowel toxicity, you have to have that, for lack of a better word, band across the equator. Where am I picking up black? Okay. Now, the more narrow the line, the less the toxicity. The more narrow the line, the less the toxicity. Okay. Now, as the band gets wider, of course, it indicates a greater degree of toxicity. And some of you have looked at eyes by now and seen that band going across there, and sometimes it's a 1/4 inch wide or wider. And the wider the band gets, and the more pronounced it gets, and if it's been there long enough, the conjunctiva overlying the sclera right there will actually get thick. It'll actually look like there's a buildup right across the eye at that point. Okay, that just shows that you have advanced, long-standing toxicity right there. But the wider the band gets, the greater the degree of toxicity. Now, right down here would be the so-called 30 row. Is that correct? Now, if this band extends downward, if it gets wide enough that it's extending downward to the point where it is firmly in the 30 row, doesn't have to be clear down to the latitude line, but if it's extending downward toward the 30 row, in an adult, it shows increased kidney stress. Now, just remember, we're talking across the equator. Then I'll go through with you and I'll tell you that there are some meanings that only set on one side or the other of the eye. We're talking about both eyes, the equator line. Now, if it extends downward, now we're talking about those patterns found in either eye. Okay? Now, if that extends downward, it shows that in an adult, it shows that the degree of kidney stress is increasing. Now, if it extends upward into the teen row, so that now that you've got a rather wide band going across here, it not only begins to indicate a great degree of toxicity recirculating through the system, but it also begins to give evidence that the body tissues are not oxygenating. Now, as some of you have already picked up on, very, very frequently you will find this band more pronounced in a person that has been on the acid side for quite some time, and you'd say, well, why not the alkaline side if the bowel is gumming up? Eventually, on the alkaline side, a bowel will gum up to the point where it just won't function. But on the acid side, you've got the ionization factors, and very, very frequently the bowel is absorbing poorly digested substances or absorbing unwanted substances or in unwanted amounts, because the bowel, if it is irritated by the acidity, tends to be a little bit more, it tends to be a little easier for it to begin to effectively pick up some of this junk that we don't want back in the system. And, of course, you also know that in slight acidity in the bowel, certain substances like it. For instance, your iron likes an acid bowel to be absorbed. Okay, that's the reason why iron can effectively be used to bring a low pH up, because you can get iron through. Calcium likes an acid bowel. It's the reason why you can get lime water through. Okay, so as it extends itself downward, figure kidney stress. As it extends itself upward, figure a greater degree of lack of tissue oxygenation or a greater degree of tissue toxicity. Now, we have another factor. Well, I'm going to run out of paper if I'm not careful here. Let me just take my... Now let's just assume that this toxic bowel line along the equator is wider at the 7-12 region of the left eye. So if this is the left eye, would this be the 7-12 region? Let's assume that we've got a toxic line across that eye, and it's wider in the 7-12 region of the left eye. Here's some squigglies coming across. Over here, it's a wider band. More discoloration, more squigglies. If it is wider in the 712 region, then it shows that there is a upswing on heart stress, primarily the left side of the heart. Also gives evidence that there is some lymphatic congestion. It indicates that the heart is toxic and beginning to labor somewhat. And there seems to be a correlation between a wide band in that 712 range on the left eye and the degree of cholesterol buildup in the system in general. But there's a couple of other checks you have to utilize on that. We'll go into them a little bit later. Because it may not be cholesterol at all. It may be triglycerides building up. You remember what a triglyceride is? We talked about him in the first class. Just a plain old glycerol alcohol molecule with 3 fatty acids hooked on them. That's all he is. But depending on where you're at, it may be triglycerides. Now remember, these are general tendencies or patterns. And then we get into each eye separately. Then we will get into some specific points to watch for. And surprisingly enough, there does appear to be evidence that some things do in fact cross relative to the eye. Now let's take a look at the next thing. The equator band is thicker in the right 1 to 6. It's thicker in the right 1 to 6, and in the left 7 to 12. Now we've already mentioned that left 7 to 12 may indicate the fact that the heart is under stress and there's heart toxicity. But when you begin to see that banding on the right 1 to 6 and on the left 7 to 12, I said the right 1 to 6, left 7 to 12. When you begin to see those two areas patterning that way, then you can begin to suspicion that you have got some problem with your respiratory physiology. Either there is some congestion, there is some emphysema, there is some degree of perhaps lymphatic congestion, some irritation. But if you were to see the two eyes sitting there side by side, you see that pattern. Might be a little bit of activity in here, but you see that pattern. You know the left eye, in fact, may indicate heart toxicity. But you're also well aware of the fact that if you get any degree of lung congestion, that you're going to cause stress on the heart. If you get any degree of heart congestion, you're going to get stress on the lung. So when you see these two over here, they seem to be mutually compatible with one another. And so you can begin to get some idea of what you are faced with when you see those general patterns in the eye. Now, if you have the equator line thicker on the 7 to 12 in the right eye, you see the equator line thicker on the 7 to 12 in the right eye or the 1 to 6 in the left eye. In other words, if you were to look at both eyes now, instead of having the involvement out here where we just were, we're going to see our involved areas setting in here. Now, if you see those areas congested, you can begin to suspicion that this particular person is slowed, sluggish, toxic, poor energy. Okay, he's slowed in his actions, sluggish as far as his ability. Easily fatigued would be another factor to look for in there. Poor energy utilization. Also, begin to suspicion when you see congestion in those two areas that there is an imbalance between the pituitaries, adrenals, and thyroid. And I'll go into that later on today with you, time willing, necessary, why I think between today and part of tomorrow, why we can pretty well cover the sclerology. And then we can get back and we can work on some other things, some patterns, various other things like that we might want to talk about. Okay? Now, generally speaking, when you see congestion in this particular area, you're generally going to you're going to be able to identify by questioning this person. You're going to find in most instances he's going to refer or she is going to admit that she's tired. They're going to admit to lassitude, providing they know what the word means. Okay, I never will forget at Palmer College of Chiropractic, they used to have a case history that asked the patients if they were suffering from malaise. Okay, and of course no one knew. They said, I don't know, I guess so. Okay, but anyway, why lassitude is of course, a degree of sluggishness, of delayed responses, less than boundless energy. Okay, so you can look for that. Now you may also see either a lack of drive when you see these areas heavily congested, or on occasion you'll see these people almost with nervous drive, almost like they're just riding on their nerves. And usually what is happening here is they're hyperthyroid to a degree. And they're just literally burning up on their own nerve energy. So this equator band, depending on where it's at, can in fact give you a great deal of indications. Now, assuming that the entire thing is banded in across there, wide and happy, then you can come to a general conclusion that you've got a bowel that is toxic, that obviously the liver has not been able to handle it effectively, so it's putting stress on the kidneys. The toxicity is heavy enough in the system that it's beginning to slow the system, fatigue the system, tire the system. The heart is under stress, especially the left side of the heart. There is problems getting oxygenation to the tissues, and probably the lungs are beginning to overexpand or become fatigued in the constant effort of trying to pick up on getting proper oxygenation through, and the heart's fatiguing in attempting to get proper blood supply through the lungs. So as you look then at the toxic band across the board, and you see that toxic band, and I think that's one of the bands that your father probably showed you, isn't it, Laverne? That's the general things that you look for when you see that toxic band laying across there. Okay? It has nothing whatsoever to do with just the transverse colon. That band is a big clue to a person who has pushed his health as far as he is going to push it. He is already starting to overstress his lungs. He's starting to overstress his heart. He's starting to overstress the blood vascular system. He's starting to have a lot of ionization build up in his system. He is starting to override the liver to the point where the liver can't keep caught up. So to a degree, it even involves liver toxicity. The kidneys are under stress. Oxygenation is poor. As a result, his entire system is going to be sluggish, mentally, physically, you name it. Okay? So when you see that band, that's what it means. Now, that's just the band going across there. I told you if it widened or if it dropped, what those meant. Okay, so you're talking about a band. The narrower the band, the less the degree of overall toxicity. The wider the band, the greater the degree. If the band is wider in certain areas, it gives you an indication of what the hit point is that you want to look for, okay? Now, yes, someone had a hand up back there. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, partner. Yell just a trifling bit louder. Okay. Well, we're having a little trouble on pronunciation, but now I know what you're saying. Okay. What you have is that is a congenital thickening of the sclera and conjunctiva on an eye. And I had mentioned to them mentioned to all you testers many months ago that the first time you got a hold of yourself an anatomy book, just to look at it so that you would see it and identify it whenever you ran into it, and you would not list it as a blob, okay, when you were sending in numbers, because it's a congenital thickening right there that is familial and hereditary and seems to have absolutely no involvement that we can find right now, but I'm sure that it does have one, because now they are beginning to find that certain growth on certain parts of the face will appoint themselves to certain hereditary or other weaknesses within the system. So I'm sure in time that we'll be able to pin it down to something. But right now, it has nothing to do at all except the fact that it's there, and don't mistake it for a blob. Well, yes, and I'll go over that just a little bit later on, because alcohol is, of course, the prime enemy of calcium, and in the liver's ability and the kidney's ability to handle alcohol, it wipes out vitamin C worse than smoking. And so when you see the bright bloodshot red eyes, of the confirmed alcoholic, okay, you're also seeing the start of not only calcium deprivation, but also an established collagen disease. And that's why you see the old-time drunk with the pop belly, spindly legs, weak chest muscles, spindly arms, bony neck, poor posture, big liver, okay? You're seeing himself literally urinate away skeletons, what he's doing. No, there happens to be a factor on allergies, and I'll be going into that yet between today or tomorrow. There does appear to be a point at which these allergies show up, and they too are an involvement that shows massive vitamin C stress because the body is picking up abnormal proteins in quantities that it cannot either block with antibodies or antibody titers. And so as a result, the body builds itself up to the point where it literally goes into a state of mild anaphylactic response. And this also shows an imbalance in your vitamin C stress. And another thing is one of the things to really note is you can almost assuredly find allergies anytime you find a saliva pH lower than the urine pH. If you've got a 7.2 over a 6.4, suspicion that there's going to be allergies somewhere. Anytime that saliva pH is lower than the urine pH, suspicion that there's going to be allergies somewhere. It just tends to be one of those things that shows up. You get further into the numbers, you'll find out that even though Doc said, that you have to look at all the numbers, you'll begin to find that there are certain clues in some of the numbers that will tip you off. But we'll cover that a little bit later. Okay, let's go on now, back to our eye back here. I'll get some of this extraneous stuff out of the way. And now we're going to take a look at a congestion of vessels right around the limbus itself. What you're going to see is a bunch of vessels congested right around the limbus itself. In other words, right in tight next to the iris. Now, these vessels include those areas that touch the limbus. So that would include 6, 7, 18, 19, 36, 37, and 48 and 49. So that includes those areas on the regular eye chart. And no matter which way I shift the numbers around on that eye chart, the numbers that touch the limbus are still going to touch the limbus, okay? Now, whenever you see a congestion of vessels around there, then you want to consider very, very poor digestion. Very, very poor digestion. Achlorhydria, which means, in fact, that the body is not making enough hydrochloric acid to effectively digest the food. Achlorhydria. You may also see this congestion build up in an irritated stomach or even an irritated pylorus or upper part of the duodenum, or as Dr. Reams says, the duodenum. Okay? Of course, he goes by the English usages, which has me at a disadvantage. I don't speak English. I speak American. Okay? And in American, there's in the Midwest, there's R's and wash, so it becomes wash. Okay? And stuff like that. So I do not speak the English language at all. And if you doubt me, why, ask Hayward Hale Broom. So anyway, going on to what I'm saying is that it can be in the pylorus or it can be in the duodenum, but suspicion that there is a degree of irritation relative to the upper digestive